eventually chose freedom over unrealizable justice after being detained for years and facing a 175-year sentence with no effective remedy. Justice, for me, is now precluded as the US government insisted in writing into its plea agreement that I cannot file a case at the European Court of Human Rights or even a Freedom of Information Act request over what it did to me as a result of its extradition request. I want to be totally clear. I am not free today because the system worked. I am free today after years of incarceration because I pled guilty to journalism. I pled guilty to seeking information from a source. I pled guilty to obtaining information from a source. And I pled guilty to informing the public what that information was. I did not plead guilty to anything else.
Man.
Okay, Wiley, great. On the ball. Hey, everybody, welcome to The Whiners with Jeff Norman and Wiley Michelle and Ryan Milton. Our special guest tonight is Matt Ho, Marine veteran. Ooh. And what's that lofty title I saw you have for the Eisenhower Group?
Associate Director, Jeff.
Associate Director. I don't remember seeing that a few months ago. Is that a new title, or I just didn't see it?
That's the same title for the last couple of years. I was with Eisenhower Media Network for a couple of years prior to that, just as a fellow, and then just opportunity there was to do something more full time with them, and so happy to be working with them in that capacity and to have this lofty, shiny, very impressive title that got you all excited. So
the website is lofty also, because I saw Lieutenant Colonel Larry Wilkerson on there and some images, obviously, of Eisenhower. So is it predominantly military figures?
It is. So Eisenhower Media Network was founded almost 5 years ago now. And the idea was to get voices from former military officers, former intelligence officers, former national security officials into the mainstream media. And certainly this is something we can talk about because it's been a trying experience, as you would expect. But we have, it's essentially a speakers bureau in a lot of ways, not as much as a think tank. And we have former military officers, we have former FBI agents, former intelligence officers, and we're doing our best to try and get their voices into the media that exists in our country, which is dominated by voices that represent the military-industrial complex. And this is why we use the title of Eisenhower, because, of course, of Eisenhower's infamous farewell address in 1961, where he warned of the dangers of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
And certainly when you have in corporate media and our mainstream media, more than 90% of those who comment on the military and war and the defense budget having some type of financial connection, direct or indirect, to the weapons industry, you can see that possibly Eisenhower was only touching on, the very, very tip of this, iceberg, to speak. Yeah.
That phrase, the military-industrial complex, resonated very strongly for many years with the left in particular. Mm-hmm. But nowadays, perhaps because Trump started using the phrase deep state, they don't seem to be as enthusiastic about it anymore. But isn't the deep state essentially the same thing?
It is essentially the same thing. You'd hear that term before Trump started using it. So go back, say, 11 years ago or so, you'd hear it. And it was, I think, synonymous with the military-industrial complex. I think it had more of a connotation of being with regards to the intelligence services.
Clandestine, yeah.
More with the exactly, Wiley. But this idea, it's not a preposterous idea. Any institution or any leviathan, if you will, or ecosystem, however you want to describe this, any industry that is more than $1 trillion a year is going to have an inertia to it, an institutional inertia to it, a depth to it that is undeniable. And that's what you have, I think, in this understanding of the deep state military-industrial complex. I think the deep state refers more to the permanent presence institutionally within the government of a class a war class, if you will, a military class, if you will.
Is it also
while
like
the military industrial complex is
technocrat
more of
types?
outside the government.
Oh, okay. I was just going to
Yeah.
say the deep state, is that also like technocratic layers, people who have just, they're unelected, they're unappointed, they're almost like at the employee level, but high level.
Yeah,
Right?
I would say that. And I would say that extends into the White House, and where you have it into the congressional offices, and where you have that overlap is with the military industrial complex and the deep state. Is the military industrial complex is what informs who's in the deep state. And in the military, so what you have is the great revolving door that we all know of. So there's nobody who's going into the White House to deal with national security affairs who isn't vetted and approved of by the military industrial complex. And then, of course, when people leave, and the same with congressional offices, right? So in congressional offices, the staffers, whether on committees or they're in personal offices, the people who are working on these issues, issues of war and peace, they come out of the defense industry, or they come out of think tanks funded by the defense industry. And then when they go out of office, right? So if Joe Biden, or I should say Kamala Harris doesn't win and the Democrats leave, or when she does win and, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and all their staffs are shown the door, well, they're just going to go into an ecosystem, an environment that's ready and waiting for them. So that's where you see this nexus, how the military industrial complex and the deep state, if you use that term, are intertwined, and they're reliant on one another. They're symbiotic. And the military industrial complex is massive and spreads, not just in Washington D.C. and in the weapons companies, but it extends, kind of touched on before, on the media. It extends to the universities. It extends to the banks. It extends to the fossil fuel companies. ExxonMobil's largest customer is who? The Pentagon, right? So you see that overlap and that interconnection and that symbiotic relationship. And this is why you understand why Eisenhower used that phrase and described it as a complex.
Our friend Scott Ritter has had flirtations with think tanks that are definitely in this deep state world. And before I think all parties realized they really weren't meant for each other. What about the Eisenhower fellows?
I would have liked to have been a part of some of those conversations.
Well, he had some good.
What are we talking? Are we talking like CFR? Like, what are we talking here?
Well, I forgot which think tanks he was talking about. He has some good stories about offers that were made to him, but he couldn't be bought. But seriously, do any of the Eisenhower
question? Just answer Wiley's question. It's nearly all the think tanks.
Yeah,
part of it. I mean, Quincy Institute did a report a year and a half ago on this, and they found that every think tank that touches on foreign affairs or on defense policy within Washington D.C. takes money in some way or form from either the government directly, because the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, they fund think tanks directly, from foreign governments, from NATO, or from the weapons industry. Yep. And the ones that don't make that list are the ones that don't make their donors public. So you have a handful of think tanks in Washington, D.C., Quincy being one, Center for International Policy, Institute for Policy Studies. There's a handful out there that don't receive this money from the military industrial complex, whether it's government or non-governmental. But the whole thing is, basically, it's brilliant when you look at it and you understand how effective they have been at controlling policy to meet their interests.
Not even.
Well, have you or the other fellows had any flirtations with the think tank? I mean, I'm not saying this just because you're with us, but you are really a superb analyst, and not only that, a kick-ass communicator, which I would think would be have some appeal to these think tanks, although you don't necessarily, kowtow to the powers that be. So, have there been any flirtations?
No, I mean, I was with Center for International Policy for a long number of years. We're one of the few. We don't take corporate donations. I don't know. Actually, let me correct myself. The CIP did take corporate donations from Sheridan to fund a rainforest initiative that we had. But for the most part, no corporate donations of any kind. No, I mean, I certainly was a part of that world for a number of years, Jeff. For years, I was in Washington, D.C. I was at Congress all the time. I was at these think tanks, going to the events, speaking on panels. And no, it just, if you're going to speak in this manner and you're not going to please who the funders are, there's no room for you whatsoever. So this is why Scott would never be a part of it. The people who are part of my of the Eisenhower Media Network, others out there, people at Quincy Institute as well. Just there's no room. There's no space for someone who's not going to agree with what the funder wants. And I know personally of people who've been censored, who were at certain think tanks, including think tanks that were supposed to be very progressive, very open-minded, dedicated to free speech and all this nonsense. And, you know, when they send in when they go to write a paper or publish an article and it's critical of one of the funders, you can't say that. And so no, it's a very obscene system, but it's one that you can respect because it's very effective.
Yeah, well, censorship seems to be the big bugaboo, and it's heartening to see so many top-notch speakers really focusing on it now.
Yeah.
Our friend Julian Assange, of course, may be one of the best examples of a person who's been censored and how to really eat shit. But, you know, you do what you have to do to get your freedom. You've been fairly intimately involved with his story for quite a while, have you not?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate, very grateful that I've been able to speak on behalf of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for a number of years now. First time I probably commented publicly on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, I believe, was in the spring of 2010. And I was on MSNBC, and I was asked about the collateral murder video, which was the Apache gunship video that WikiLeaks released in the spring of 2010 that showed the murder of civilians, the wounding of children, and the killing of journalists. From this and
it was like a nighttime raid, I believe, right?
It was, you know, it was during daytime. It's just that the video was grainy and kind of black and white. And but I mean, it's horrific because of the attitude of the air crew, the attitude of the Americans on the ground, their willingness to kill, and their delight in it, as well as how it was just a clear war crime and execution of people on the street. And, you know, just to make one point about it, when a van shows up to help those who were shot, Apache gunship it shoots up that van, and then it turns out there are children in that van. And the air crew's response to being told there's children in it was, that's their fault for bringing their kids to a gunfight. Right? I mean, that was the type. And being on MSNBC, and I was alongside another guy who had been in the wars, and they asked us what our response to this all was. And our response was, both mine and Tony's, was I'm shocked that people are shocked. What do you think we've been doing over there for all these years? You know, and so that type of thing where you just did not have the understanding among the American public of what the war actually looked like. And this is something that Julian Assange commented on in Strasbourg a couple of days ago when he testified before the Council of Europe. Was he noted the difference between the collateral murder video released in 2010 and now, where we have, you know, on our phones a genocide live streamed to us, you know, and so, but also too, the apathy or the willingness of people to look away or to deny what's put in front of them is really something. But yeah, I've been fortunate, as I said, to be able to speak in support of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange for you know, the better part of a decade now.
But he said in that testimony, which really got my attention, he said, my naivete was believing that the law worked.
Yeah, and I actually have the clip of that. Let me put that up.
Yeah.
Had ever been prosecuted for publishing classified information from the United States, either domestically or internationally. I expected some kind of harassment legal process. I was prepared to fight for that. I believe the value of these publications was such that it's okay to have that fight, and that we would prevail because we had understood what was legally possible. My naivete was believing in the law. When push comes to shove, laws are just pieces of paper, and they can be reinterpreted for political expediency. They are the rules made by the ruling class more broadly. And if those rules don't suit what it wants to do, it reinterprets them or, hopefully, changes them, which is clearer. In the case of the United States, we angered one of the constituent powers of the United States, the intelligence sector, the security state, the secrecy state. It was powerful enough to push for a reinterpretation of the US Constitution. The US First Amendment seems pretty black and white to me. It's very short. It says the Congress shall make no law restricting speech or the press. However, that was that the U.S. Constitution, those precedents relating to it, were just reinterpreted away. And yes, perhaps ultimately, if it got into the Supreme Court of the United States, and I was still alive in that system,
Yeah.
I might have won, depending on what the makeup was of the U.S. Supreme Court. But
Oh,
Yep.
here we go. There you are.
Thank you. I thought that was just such an important clip. Just to sit and listen through it, and you can tell he speaks much more quickly through the rest of it. You can tell how much he's struggling with, like, trying to articulate just how brutal, like, just how intensely they went after him. And in that speech, he does also go through the CIA's plot to kill him, which is.
Well, was he
stunning.
upset, or I have not seen him speak in a long time, so I actually don't know if this was overwhelming emotion. I think it was too, like you're saying, or is that how he speaks?
Sorry, I don't mean emotion, but I mean for the rest of it, I have watched the whole thing, and he actually spoke a lot more quickly.
Yeah.
But I think it is such a complex thing to talk about. How to deal with the fact that these laws do seem like they are simple and like you understand them right up until they're reinterpreted to go after you. So I was interested in hearing Matt's opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, first to Julian's commentary, his comments, he was, I think a lot of people felt halting and cautious, particularly when he read his statement. But then as the Q&A began, his responses were just masterful. I mean, his responses were brilliant. I mean, in his ability to articulate, and for the first time speaking publicly. So April 2019 was when they dragged him out of the Ecuadorian embassy and put him in Belmarsh. So he's not been heard from since. But even before that, they had severely limited his ability to communicate. So I'm not actually sure when the last time he spoke publicly was. And certainly he's not been able to speak publicly in a setting like that since he went into the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012. And before that, he was under house arrest, essentially. You know, he says
14 years or something.
Yeah.
I remember we used to see him come out on the balcony there, and we didn't hear him talk.
To hear him talk, exactly, and let alone to present and to be asked questions by the parliamentarians of the Council of Europe. So he didn't start off, on a simple, with a simple program. And when he begins his talk, he does reference that it was in 2010 that he was living in Paris, and he left Paris, and he was not able to return to France until this week. So more than 14 years, essentially. But the points about, I was really struck as well with regards to the point about being naive about the law. And I encourage people to watch the video. It's only about an hour and 10 minutes long, and it's so important to listen to him, but also for him to articulate these things we're talking about coming out of Belmarsh prison and out of this persecution and prosecution. But he gives a really great definition of what lawfare is. And lawfare is something that we hear continually now. And the idea of lawfare, as Julian says, to paraphrase him, is it's not litigation. It's not the pursuit of justice. It's to use the law to achieve a political end. And that's essentially what occurred to him. And the reason why, for folks who aren't familiar, the reason why he was at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, France, testifying was because that was on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, then the Council of Europe received a report on his imprisonment, on his prosecution, as well as they put together a resolution and they voted in favor of it. And you can go online and read that as well. But just to summarize it, they essentially said that the Council of Europe said that for the acts of journalism, Julian was prosecuted or been persecuted as a political prisoner. And so the Council of Europe saying quite clearly he was a political prisoner whose offense was journalism. And I think
an American political prisoner, that's impossible.
Yeah.
It's the land of the
he's not
free.
even American. And this is something to get
Yeah.
back to, I think, Jeff, to your point about censorship, if we want to talk about that. But the phrase you hear over and over and over again throughout that hour and 10-minute long talk, in Q&A, is transnational repression. And that's what people really need to take away from this, is the idea, if there's a villain in a story, it is clearly the United States.
Right.
And the idea that transnational, that it's just not pertaining to, Jeff and I in North Carolina, Ryan in Texas, and Wiley in California, but around the world, because, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So they
all-
want to
he
use
makes the point.
they want to use U.S. laws against him on one hand, but on the other hand, they won't give him the rights that he would normally have as an American either.
That's exactly right. And that's
Yeah,
perverse.
he goes through
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that's ultimately what the British court had to reconcile, was the fact that he was being biased by his nationality, and that's where it falters in the British court system. But even before it gets to that point, and really, occasionally our corporate media will put out something that kind of gives away the secrets, and it's always after the fact, though, not when something actually matters. So after Julian is released in June, the Washington Post runs a big story explaining the Justice Department's decision to engage in a plea deal with him. And essentially, it's clear from what the Justice Department is saying is that this was always a political prosecution. It was always based upon his work as a journalist, and we would lose in court on the issue of free speech. Why the Post didn't publish that 14 years ago, 12 years ago, 6 years ago, last year, they chose to publish such a story after Julian release. Of course, a subject to discuss about the reality of our corporate media, but it's clear what he endured, why he endured, and of course the danger. And this is why I keep the Julian Assange poster behind me, because the danger is still there. The concern is still there. Nothing has gone away. And the fact that it was through a plea deal, it makes it open-ended. So as far as the U.S. government is concerned, there was no outcome to this. There was a plea deal, but no judge in the U.S. said what we were doing is wrong, so we can do it again.
Well, not only was there a plea deal, the plea deal required him to, as he says, plead guilty to journalism,
Right,
which is
right.
actually a worse outcome than just,
And it restricts what he can do in the way of pursuing recourse.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what can you tell us about this body called PACE? What is the significance of going before them? It doesn't seem like it has much teeth as far as authority goes, but maybe it has a lot of PR value.
I think that's mainly it. So PACE is the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and so Julian was before their committee for legal affairs and human rights. That committee was the one that wrote the report that was submitted to the council, as well as the resolution that the council approved. The Council of Europe composes 46 nations. It represents 750 million people or something like that. But it's not the European Commission. It's not the EU. right? It's not European parliamentarians either in the European Commission, in the EU, or in their home governments. But it has a presence, it has a reputation, it has a prestige, and it is meant to serve as a guiding post for Europe. And so it is taken very seriously. It is respected. It doesn't have teeth, as you say. They can't promulgate something, but certainly the fact that the Council of Europe said so clearly and also articulates so well in its reports what occurred and how this was a political persecution and the dangers to, and this is something that came up in the conversation as well. The United States was in its own separate box. And with regards to the discussion about the rest of the world, how do we preclude this? How do we stop it, and how do we roll it back?
And they talk a lot in it about how, he's not from America, but also America is the country putting pressure on its allies to go after him, which also makes it difficult to deal with it legally because you have other countries that are trying to get him out doing the bidding of the United States, but not acknowledging that that's what's happening. And I would wonder how, what do you think would happen if it was in front of the EU? Because when you look at how the allied governments to the United States treated him, I don't know how it would go.
Well, the hope was Julian, of course, was he like I said before, he leaves France in 2010. The collateral murder video comes out. It becomes, and then of course over the summer, that summer 2010, you have the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war logs. You have the State Department cables. Prior to that, you had the Guantanamo Bay cables, which were released before all of this. So by the summer of 10, he's got a bullseye on his back. And he's basically under home arrest. And then in 2012, he goes into the Ecuadorian embassy, kind of in exile. And then 2019, the Brits pull him out and put him in Belmarsh. And so, all during this time, there's no judicial process for him until he's in Belmarsh. And of course, the Brits hold him there for years. And one British judge after another who, and Julian, is another point that I really think people should listen to what Julian talks about, because his explanation of the ruling class, his explanation of the conflicts of interest within the British judicial system that preclude any form of justice in a situation like this. Just off the top of my head, the judges that Julian had hearing the American extradition request for him, these judges had connections to the British security and intelligence services. These judges had personal connections with the Prime Minister's office. In one case, there was a loan involved.
They weren't impartial, you're saying.
I'm sorry?
They were not impartial.
No, by far, no, right? So
Obviously
you start
not.
seeing that type of connection among the elites, and then that crosses boundaries. But ultimately, if the High Court in London had not ruled allowing Julian an appeal, because what happens eventually gets to the point where the High Court says, yes, Julian Assange, you have the right to an appeal. And that's when the Americans know the jig is up. Like, if this goes to appeal and he's actually able to plead, there's a number of reasons why the British court cannot go along with our extradition court request. Now, to get to what Wiley was trying to get to is the idea is that if that had failed, the next step would have been the European Court of Human Rights.
Yes.
And that would, and the assumption was that was his best chance, was going to be in the European Court of Human Rights, because it was clear that there were several aspects of the European Court, the European Declaration of Human Rights, in which this was a massive transgression, whether it was free speech, whether the fact he's a political prisoner, whether that, as Jeff, you said, the Americans are going to try him under their laws, but not give him the rights under their laws as well. So there's a number of things that if it had gone to the European Court of Human Rights, many people believe he would have won. But the Americans were also doing everything possible to prevent that from ever happening.
Well, and that was my question, because when you watch what America's done in terms of the UN courts, for example, in terms of threatening people, in terms of trying to sanction the people who are making the decisions, are any of these courts safe from that type of pressure?
No. You have, most famous, you have when the Rome Statute is enacted among countries around the world, which creates the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which allows for this court to indict and prosecute in jail war criminals, particularly heads of states. And we saw that with Slobodan Milosevic out of Serbia.
Yeah.
In 2003 or 2004, the U.S. Congress passes what's known as the Hague Invasion Act. And this is essentially the U.S. Congress providing authorization to any future American president that if the International Criminal Court ever takes into custody an American citizen, the United States president has the authorization to use military force against the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And we've seen this over and over again, both with the ICC and the ICJ, threats of sanctions. The ICC prosecutor was looking at several years ago, looking into war crimes in Afghanistan, and the United States government, through the Congress, made it clear that the ICC would be sanctioned by the United States if that were to happen. And of course, we've not seen that yet in terms of the United States flexing those types of muscles with regards to the expected arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister. But you have to believe that this Congress will do something like that.
Well, and they have said behind the scenes, like the members of that court did come out and say they were being threatened and blackmailed. So,
and there's all types of, you go back 20 years to 2003, and the United Nations Security Council has taken up this issue of the imminent invasion of Iraq by the United States and Britain and others. And the great Catherine Gunn, who there's a film made about her a few years ago with Keira Knightley, and I'm blanking on the name of the film, but it's a terrific film. And Catherine, though, was an analyst for GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA, so Signals Intelligence, Electronic Intelligence, and she received an order. Yes,
Official
exactly.
Secrets.
Yeah, terrific film. And she received she and the other people in her office received an order that comes from the United States, essentially, that says you're going to spy on the UN Security Council and you're going to get us everything we need to blackmail them and extort them and make sure nothing happens in the UN Security Council regarding our invasion of Iraq. I mean, and that was 20 some odd years ago. I mean, like the idea that anything's changed, it could only have gotten worse is certainly how we have to understand it.
And if there was any consistency to it, there are a number of American officials who should have already been charged long ago based on all these actions.
So Vita 83 does ask, and has been asking on the side, therefore then, what does the Constitution mean if there's no consequence for breaking it as a government? What is the Constitution worth?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. The number of times that we should have had constitutional crises in our country in this century, in the last 24 years.
How about the last 2 years, numerous. 3 years?
Yeah,
exactly. In the next 2 or 3 years. I mean, you have that. You have. I mean, I guess if you're going to say my favorite one would be the CIA spying on the Senate.
Yeah.
The Senate, and Dianne Feinstein, to her credit, probably one of the few times I'll ever praise her name. But Dianne Feinstein, to her credit, led the Senate. And also there's a film about this as well with, I'm not going to be able to remember. It's on Amazon. And
Ryan will know. He knows.
Yeah, Adam Driver's in it. Another good film about this as well. So these things always come out years after the fact, though. And it's all, at that point, it's all just, ancient
water
history.
under the
but
bridge.
they didn't. But they never change it, and they never stop it. That's what gets to me about the fact that we pretend like it's stopped. It's like it's the same stuff around, like when they do the church committee. Nothing changes. Right. We learn things, but nothing changes, and then everyone's like, "Oh, it's all better." I don't.
Right. And so in this case, with Feinstein, she has her people look into the CIA's torture program. If people remember, they published a huge report on this, and most of it is never seen the light of day. The executive summary did for a bit, but the bulk of it has never been public. But anyway, the CIA under John Brennan, who is now a darling of CNN and everything, they hack into and they break into the Senate's computers. Yeah. I mean, so you have the CIA, the executive branch, breaking into the legislative branch, in this most egregious manner. And there were never any consequences. And what you saw actually happen is the person who investigated this for the White House was Avril Haines. And now, of course, Avril Haines is the director of national intelligence. She's at the top of the intelligence. Avril Haines also gave blessings to the drone strikes and advised Obama that we really shouldn't investigate this torture stuff too much. We really should just let it go. And that's how you get to be a director of national intelligence, is you do such things that make the empire understand and appreciate your value, your value to it.
Well, and Julian even talks about bringing in legal action, and how the CIA says, no, that's confident, like it's classified. Right. So you can't try us. You can't come in and actually deal with.
And that's the case for any of the whistleblowers, John Kiriakou, Daniel Hale, Jeffrey Sterling, any of these people who have tried to let the American public know what its government's doing, and then faced incredibly harsh consequences going to jail for it. Their trials have been secret trials. They always occur in the Eastern District of Virginia, the National Security Court, as it's known. And the trial is a secret trial. Any other government that conducted it that way, we would decry it. Freedom House would rank them as not free. We would probably be sanctioning them, unless, of course, they were buying our weapons. Then, of course, we'd be okay with it. But, it is. The nature of this is really insidious. And it just, Wiley, to your point, it continues to grow.
Well, the whistleblower who is the star of the moment, Julian Assange, I think is now free to expose whatever might be going on with Israel, whatever might be going with Russia, Ukraine, etc. Can we expect Julian to play a role with his colleagues at WikiLeaks to expose whatever might be coming their way at the Middle East war?
I don't know, Jeff. What Julian went through, I think we'd all agree he doesn't have to do anything else in the rest of his life. He can eat Cheetos and watch Netflix for the rest of his life, and he's done more than anyone ever could. And he's paid a price that no one ever, as well as his family. So I think there's still a lot of recovery that has to occur for Julian. And I've not heard anything about what he plans to do or what he's thought about doing. And certainly I think, like most of us, though, I think you all are on the same page as me. We need him, though. We want him to do something. Of course, that's very selfish.
Yeah, I say that. I hope it didn't sound like having expectation.
It's
more like a longing than an expectation.
Exactly. Because we need, he is, I've met him. I met him in the Ecuadorian embassy. And he is one of those people that strikes you in the sense of how intelligent he is, but also how empathetic he is. When I went to go see him, this was in 2014, and I had some trepidation because they had that whole propaganda campaign against him about how he didn't shower, how he was selfish, how these types of things.
They claimed he was smearing feces on the walls. Like that's ridiculous.
Like he was going crazy or something, right?
Yeah. And you go in there.
They got his baby's diaper. The
diaper was to confirm the DNA to make sure it was his kid. Yeah. And
so
all that invasion of privacy. But when I met him, you're struck by this man is 180 degrees of the opposite of what our media is telling us he is.
Of course.
This guy, incredibly bright. The only other person I feel that level of intelligence that I've met, and probably a few are escaping my mind, but Dan Ellsberg type of level of intelligence. He just comes out of the eyes at you. This person is so smart, but also too, but like Dan, the same way, that empathy, that compassion, that understanding where he is in respect to history and his fellow human beings. That's who Julian Assange is. And so certainly for that reason alone, we need Julian. But as you said, Jeff, it's more of a longing than a demand. And
we have you, Matt. We have you, Matt. So what's your latest take on what's going on?
Very much an ersatz Assange. So, but thank you.
Well, whatever. You can be modest if you want. Nonetheless, we want to hear what your take is on what's going on in the Middle East war.
Oh, good God! I don't know if we can. I'll channel as I like to do when I get asked about kind of future Yogi Berra, because Yogi Berra said predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. And I think it pertains with Israel and with this government that Netanyahu leads. It is the personification is the realization of the Nixon Kissinger madman strategy, the madman theory. People aren't familiar with that. Towards the end of the Vietnam War, early 1970s, Nixon, Kissinger had this madman strategy. The idea being is that you're going to be so unpredictable. You're going to be so mad that it's going to frighten your enemies and they're going to negotiate with you. They're going to capitulate because they don't know what you're going to do next. So the idea being, with regards to, say, not just the Vietnamese, with the Russians, man, Nixon is so crazy. He might drop an atomic bomb on Hanoi. No, not this, that. He might drop an atomic bomb on Vladivostok. You know, I mean, like that type of, you can't even begin to fathom what this person might do because they're in a completely different headspace than you. And I think many of us have experienced that this last year watching the genocide in Gaza, right? Because we see things that are just so unbelievable. It's incredible. How could this be occurring? Because none of us could ever think this thing possible. None of us would ever do this or conceive of it. So this idea of where this might go, in the sense that Iran has now clearly demonstrated twice through warnings, one in April where they gave about 3 days notice of their attack, and they sent over old inventory. They cleared out their warehouses. They sent out their old drones, their own old missiles, right? And it was a clear warning. This attack this past week from the Iranians, very similar, because they actually did give about 3 or 4 hours notice to the Americans that they were going to attack Israel.
Why would they do that?
Then they sent less than 200 missiles, and they targeted them at air bases and other facilities, but knowing full well that, you know, the Israeli troops are all going to be in bunkers. Any of the equipment that needs to be protected, or certainly any of the aircraft, are going to be in bunkers, or the aircraft, the F-35s, the F-15, they'll put them up in the sky, that type of thing. So that, again, it was another warning, but it was a much deeper and stronger warning. And now, of course, what we've seen today from the Iranians, their statement supposedly to the Americans was that this phase of unilateral self-restraint is over. And they supposedly, the Iranians said very clearly to the Americans, we will consider an attack on us will be responded to, including by those who are assisting in the attack. And they warn that they will strike Israeli infrastructure through unconventional means. I mean, so what has happened here, I think, and there's so many different aspects of it, but just from the Iranian perspective to understand it, is that they have this axis of resistance made up of Palestinians, the Lebanese through Hezbollah, the Syrians, the Iraqis, and the Yemenis. And Israel their plan is to systematically degrade each one of those, right? So if you have the idea of like the fist is stronger than 5 fingers type of thing, so you just start breaking fingers and all of a sudden the fist is just down to the thumb. And the Iranians understand that. And there's other aspects of this, but I think this is probably the most important for me as to why the Iranians feel the need to respond as they are right now. There's other things too. I mean, certainly, how could they not respond? Their allies being attacked like this. This is the second assassination of one of their peers. The first, Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political leader in Tehran during the Iranian president's inauguration. So such a great insult, but then also too, this killing of Nasrallah. And as we now know, Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, had agreed to a ceasefire. The Americans had told the Lebanese that the Israelis were with them on a ceasefire as well. And so what occurs is Nasrallah at the end of the week and his people have agreed to a ceasefire that the Americans have told them the Israelis has also agreed to. So this whole Coppola type Godfather moment, right? I'm referencing in The Godfather that great baptism scene, right? Where Michael Corleone is holding the baby and he's renouncing evil and the work of Satan. Meanwhile, his goons are assassinating people all throughout the city. You know, same thing occurs last week at the UN, where Netanyahu's standing at the podium of the UN. He begins by talking about peace, how Israel wants peace. And at that moment, the Israeli fighter jets were getting fueled up to go and assassinate Nasrallah and kill hundreds and hundreds of Lebanese.
Yeah.
And
And,
so
they're
this is
telling
what
them they're
the Iranians are
negotiating the whole time when they're really not negotiating at
No,
all. They're about to
there's an
attack.
article from Politico this past Monday that's really important for people to look at because it's primarily about Brett McGurk and Amos Hochstein, who are the top 2 White House officials for the Middle East. And they basically say, they say to Politico, and others say as well, that, look, we've been talking out of both sides of our mouths. We've been saying publicly we want a ceasefire, but we've been telling the Israelis.
We're the ones escalating.
Yeah, and the Americans telling the Israelis, even though we're speaking ceasefire, we want you to go into Lebanon. And this is where it gets really crazy. And this is where you have to understand these madmen actually believe the reality that they exist in. The quote in Politico is that the White House believes an Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon will change things for the better and make the world a better place. This is the insanity. This is the worldview. This is the realism that these people live in. And this is what the Iranians are witnessing and up against. And so they made this latest warning, and we'll see how the Israelis respond. But everything we've seen, there's nothing. If one of you were to say, do you think the Israelis will try and assassinate the Iranian supreme leader? I don't know. Possibly. Would the Israelis use a nuclear weapon? Very possible.
I guess
well, it's kind of an open secret that Israel has nuclear weapons. Right. I guess that's a way of characterizing it as an open secret. Do we have to worry about that? And what is known among those who do know, as far as where they have these weapons, how much they have, and so forth?
Yeah, certainly I would defer to Scott, but the numbers
Scott,
are.
I've heard
for the Israeli nuclear weapons program, large part which begins back in the 60s, and they steal a lot of it from the U.S. But the Israeli nuclear weapons program is between, I think, 300 and 600 warheads. It is enough to destroy the whole world, essentially, because we only need about 100 warheads to go off worldwide to create nuclear winter that kills us all eventually from starvation. But the idea that would the Israelis use that, I don't see why not, Jeff. Look at what they've done, right? Look at everything they've done. And then what are the consequences being? What consequences would they receive from using a nuclear weapon? Say they use a nuclear weapon to destroy the Iranian nuclear facilities in the surrounding area. Who's going to do anything about it? What's going to happen, right? I mean, the American Congress would probably pass a resolution celebrating it.
Well, actually, they were coming to the defense.
That's all that matters to them.
They were coming to the defense of Israel almost immediately, and it was just one right after the other. Now, I grabbed a CBS News clip, which you may have seen on Twitter from, I think it was 1982. Just listen to the first few seconds. I want you to comment on this here.
Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer reporting Israel unleashed another massive air attack on Palestinian guerrilla targets in Lebanon today.
From the sky, the howl of Israeli jets, bombing and bombing.
Tonight, Israel has never been closer to nor more in control of an Arab capital.
In the summer of 1982, Israel invaded neighboring Lebanon in an attempt to drive the Palestinian Liberation Organization out of its encampments on the southern border with Israel. Israeli officials justified the attack as a defensive action required to take out terrorists. But as the story played out on American television, a different narrative began to emerge, one that presented Israel as the aggressor.
What in the world is going on? Israel's security problem on its border is 50 miles to the south. What's an Israeli army doing here in Beirut? The answer is that we are now dealing with an imperial Israel, which is solving its problems in someone else's country. World opinion be damned.
I just wanted to stop right there. I mean, can you imagine anybody saying imperial Israel?
Not being on corporate media, certainly not. No, I was not aware of that film. I saw it as well, Ryan. I think we commented to each other about it. It's called Occupation Movie is the name of the Twitter handle or the X handle.
Right.
And I can't remember the actual name of the film. It's a number of years ago, but just even that clip, if you all post that, the 9 minutes is really worth people's time because it explains how Israel was in a predicament in the early 80s where American public opinion was fading. They were losing it. And the American media was criticizing them. And so what Israel did, and you have to give them credit where credit's due, they got together, they got their PR and propaganda and media people together with American PR and propaganda and media people. And during that video, they'll show you the list of people at that first meeting and you pause it. And it's like the head of marketing of Pepsi Cola. You know, I mean, it's really incredible who these people were.
It's a nasty list. Yeah.
Yeah. But the goal, though, is to create this media operation that effectively brings Israel back to the understanding the Americans have of this David fighting all these hostile Arab, Muslim Goliaths. Right. And so to get the, and this is the birth of what's called Hasbara. The information operations of Israel, which if people are on Twitter or X, you've heard that phrase before, Hasbara trolls, and it's very real. And up until this year, Israel was very good at it. And up until this year, you had a majority of the American public still believing in the mythology of Israel. I believed it. I mean, growing up, my understanding of Israel was, from, books by James Michener and Herman Wouk, glorifying 1947 and 48 and how these Jews came to a land without people, and they populated it. And then these Arabs came and these Muslims came and started attacking them. And, that storyline, that mythology. And over the last year, especially, that has broken down completely. One, I think, by the ability of the Palestinian people to tell their story because they all have, these phones, but also, too, because of independent media, because of the ability to do this. If anyone, go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is I think it's interesting, though, because when you watch the rest of that clip, you can see that there was video footage of these massacres. They had, even then, that video footage of people just wiped out in the streets, just thousands of people getting killed. And it's obvious it's war crimes. But then they get to a point also where they're consolidating all the media in America and you cease to see those things. You don't see them on screen. And I do think it's, I guess my question is, they talk about madman theory as though it is just this idea of someone not knowing what you're going to do next. But is the reality of what that is, because when you look at what Nixon did, there are quotes from Nixon during Vietnam where he's and Cambodia, where he's basically saying, I don't give a damn about the civilian deaths. The difference between you and me, and he's talking to Kissinger, is that I don't give a damn about the civilian deaths. And I really wonder if calling it madman theory in that way is kind of even almost a cover for us to not understand that what it actually is brute force, mass death constantly, a willingness to just massacre
it's conscious.
people.
What you're saying is it's not madness, it's conscious. Right,
no,
Robbie?
I'm saying we imply madman theory is an idea of not knowing what someone will do. But I think in reality, it is just we are willing to use mass, wildly illegal, totally criminal violence
And we
against
know it.
other countries. Yeah,
Right.
that's what I wonder.
I think the difference, between now and 50 years ago was Nixon had some restraints on him.
Yeah.
Right. At that point, he had a Congress that was willing to stand up against him, even though he just, in 72, he wins re-election overwhelmingly. He's a popular president at that point, but he still has a Congress that's contentious. But he also has a world order that exists that provides restraints on him. And they have grander ambitions. They have grander goals. They want to normalize relations with China. That's not possible if they put an A-bomb onto Hanoi. Right. Yeah. So there were restraints there on them that don't seem to exist now. I shouldn't say don't exist now.
The lobbying.
The lobbying is exactly
just clearing out anyone who doesn't support this. So
that's right.
And they've got their candidates in the presidency who have no other option.
And how we get to this point is the system, the establishment, the elites, the empire, understanding those restraints and doing what they can to remove them. So where you see one of the restraints on Nixon was American public opinion. And, they really thought that people were going to come over the fence into the White House, and maybe they should have, but this idea then that as you look at the 60s and in the 70s and the success of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement going into the 80s, the success of the nuclear movement, what the system says is we have to protect ourselves from this. So we need to insulate ourselves with cash. And this is the second great corruption, in modern times. The first is, I think, and I believe, as others do, that television is a huge culprit in cash coming into campaigns, right? Because campaigns become so much more expensive. And so now you're not going to just bribe a politician for one specific bill. You're going to bribe them in general so that they can pay for their campaign ads and everything on TV, right? But anyway, you get to the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, what has to happen then is we have to insulate our politicians and protect them from these popular movements. And the way you do that is you make the system all about money. And what the Israelis have understood, an Israeli lobby has been in effect since before Israel was created. People want something interesting to read is how the United States kind of rams through Israel and the United Nations in the early days of the United Nations. You see that. You see the pressure that the Israel lobby puts on the Americans to do that. But now in this modern time we're in, we have essentially a political system that is legalized bribery. It's an extortion racket. And for the Israelis, they're able to do it in a manner that means that the Israeli lobby controls American Middle Eastern policy, just in the same way that Big Pharma controls our healthcare policy, in the same way that the banks control our financial policy. You know, the military-industrial complex controls our overall national security and foreign policy. You know, so until we get rid of this system of legalized bribery, nothing will change. And I think that's what the banks, the fossil fuel companies, the military-industrial complex, the Israelis, pharma, et cetera, Monsanto, et cetera, are all counting on.
Now,
how does what's going on between Iran and Israel now and the whole Middle East situation affect the upcoming U.S. elections?
Oh, it's the only thing that matters, Jeff, right? The only thing that matters to Joe Biden, even though he's not running, is...
Well, we both live in North Carolina where gas is like $2.75. Am I going to have to start paying maybe $2.85?
The danger is more than that. You had oil prices went up 5% yesterday, 4% today, I think. But the danger is that the Israelis get what they want, and they destroy not just the Iranian nuclear facilities, but they destroy Iran's oil facilities, which is also what half of the political class in Washington, D.C. wants, because the Republicans want that. Lindsey Graham won't shut up about this.
Oh, my God.
Right. And what that would mean, if you did that, if you go to this war and you have these attacks on Iranian oil infrastructure, then the Iranians respond, of course, by closing the Straits of Hormuz. Jeff, you're not going to be paying $2.85 for gas. You're going to be paying $8.85 for gas.
And
there's no way Harris wins.
They don't just say that they're going to destroy the Straits of Hormuz. They say what they're going to do is go after the oil infrastructure in all of our allies right away and our bases.
Right.
So it's way more than that. They just said, we'll set it on fire. And I don't blame them. That is not a statement of judgment. That is, if we keep escalating this, that seems like where it goes.
Now, I just wanted to jump. Jeff, you might have something more to say, but there has been a whole series of, over the last week, interventions, rallies, demonstrations. One that I wanted, in the context of what you're saying, Matt, to play just a few seconds of. A friend of ours, Jose Vega, went after...
Troublemaker.
I just was on the phone with Jose a couple hours ago. I'm blessed.
Yes, Jeff and I had interviewed him a few weeks, actually, maybe it was a couple months ago. But what he says here is directly to your point here in the beginning. Let me throw this.
Nobel Prize winning economist here to
hold it. Set it up. Tell what he set it up.
Wait. This I was going to. I'm sorry. I apologize. Yes, Paul Krugman. Oh, let me make this point. Paul Krugman was actually. Let me before I show the video. I apologize. I got so excited about this.
We will sedate you if necessary, Ryan, so just calm yourself.
Here in this quote from Paul Krugman that I quoted, he said that he was speaking at CUNY about the perception of the economy. And he says that this Trump guy was yelling about Biden refusing help to Hurricane Helene victims. So that is what he was blabbing about. And then in his masterful way, he then jumps in like this.
Nobel Prize winning economist here to tell us how great the economy is. I certainly wonder how the residents of Asheville, North Carolina must be feeling right now with no access to power or water or communication with the outside world. I wonder how enthusiastic they are about the economy right now. I wonder how enthusiastic the residents of the South Bronx must be feeling about the economy. Hey, maybe North Carolina should rename itself Israel so it'll get $20 billion in aid. Or maybe Ukraine so it can get $300 billion in aid. Maybe the South Bronx should do the same thing. I mean, I'm sure the economy is great for smug liberals like yourself who make $5 million and are worth $5 million. I'm sure the economy must be great for all you smug journalists, economists.
Okay. Well, I could watch that about 50 times.
I think I have a title for him: World's Most Articulate Heckler.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And the duration is very impressive too. He just the amount of information he gets out and before they drag him away.
And exactly. As police officers are dragging him out the door, he's still saying these things that are really important or really profound. I mean, one of the line that really grabs me is, I hope you enjoy the deaths of the children powered by our economy. Because before this, Krugman was going on about how the economy is powering this and powering that. And I think for a lot of us, seeing someone like Jose speak this type of truth to power is so refreshing, and it's so invigorating, inspiring. I mean, just the other day on Wednesday, my local food bank here, I live in Wake County. I live in Wake Forest in Wake County. Wake County being the wealthiest county in North Carolina. Wake Forest is, our median income here is $110,000 or something like that. The other day, our food bank set another record. For 2 or 3 years now, the announcements I get from the food bank has been about how they have fed more families in one day today. They have fed more families. This is a record month for us. Just on Wednesday, they fed almost 300 families. 300 cars came through the food bank on Wednesday morning in one of the wealthiest parts of North Carolina. And that's the reality. And what we're up against then is people like Krugman, who write these columns, in the New York Times, which, is the left wing of Wall Street, but basically telling people that your economic experiences aren't real. You don't know what you're talking about. You just don't understand how the economy really works. And so I really appreciate that Jose used that term smug, because that's exactly who they are.
Jose Vega is running for Congress in New York, people. I think it's Jose Vega NYC, I believe is his website, but you can look it up.
Right. He's running against, I think it's Richie Torres in the Bronx.
Yeah.
Well, and Matt, another point that he brought up that I thought was so interesting was how much money we've been spending on these wars, when they also said we ran out of FEMA money in August, right? That's right.
That's right. Actually, Matt, I want to ask you about exactly what Wiley's saying, because how do they send $8 billion to both Ukraine and Israel? Was there no appropriations? How did that happen?
That's money actually is from the appropriations back in April, but it's just the processes now where they're actually writing the check, so to speak. With the money for Ukraine, but they can appropriate additional money as they need to. I mean, the idea though is that what you have juxtaposed here is FEMA, as Wiley was saying, about $9 billion short, and then sending $8 billion to Israel, $8 billion to Ukraine, and not including FEMA's needs in that request. So whether this was money that was already appropriated, whether it was money that was newly appropriated, the point being, as Wiley was saying, is that nothing was appropriated, whether it had already been, nothing was appropriated for FEMA, whether it had already been programmed or not before. I think a year ago, we saw this very vividly with Maui, in a sense where they're saying we need this help. And then Maui fires August of 2023. Back in August of 2024, so 2 months ago now, it's been a year after the fires, more than 100 people dead, just businesses destroyed, the environment
$13 billion of damage.
Right, exactly. And at this point in August, folks in Maui, the Maui government, Hawaiian government, is saying we need about $12 billion. And FEMA is saying we're going to give you $3 billion.
Right.
And at that, it's just that idea that at that point, what had occurred, the same thing had occurred. There had been a $3 billion appropriation that went out to Israel at the same time. I mean, so like we're this idea of how we are vastly under-resourcing our infrastructure, our resources, and our people in order to do what they need. I mean, it's just not the money that is needed to go in and provide the emergency services like were needed in Maui a year ago, that were needed in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida now because of Helene, other places, the wildfires out in California, all types of things. But it's just not the money that's needed to rebuild, right? And to help people restore their lives.
Well, this
but
is
it's
a
also
kind
the
of
money that, I'm sorry?
I was going to say, this is kind of, to use a term that has been made a bad word, this is where the America First question would be redefined, I think. Don't you think?
Yeah, it is, because what you get to is point of when do we start resourcing the things up front? When do we start putting into our preparation for this type of extreme weather, these storms, the results of the climate change, as we do anything else? So we only react to it after it's occurred. Meanwhile, we have 800 military bases around the world, in an offensive posture. Right. I mean, so if people understand what I'm getting at here is that we're not putting the money into our own people and just using the FEMA as an example up front during the process or after after the emergency. Meanwhile, with the military, the egregiousness of this is just immense. It's just absolutely immense. The Congress this year has appropriated about $35 billion more for the U.S. military than the U.S. military even asked for, right? So they're giving them $35 billion more than they even asked for, which is amazing.
And
$35 billion is roughly what we spend on climate change every year.
Yeah.
Did you watch the vice presidential debate the other night?
I did not. I didn't put myself through that. I watched the presidential one, and this one I didn't have it in me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand choosing not to watch it because it is just theater. But on the other hand, these are people who may be in Washington. What do you think of the candidates?
Of Waltz and Vance?
Yeah.
I mean, I from what I understand, Waltz did not do well in the debate, and that shocked a lot of people because I think they chose Waltz because he's from a key swing state. He's also got this background, this aw shucks Midwestern persona. He was a school teacher. He was in the Guard, on and on and on. And he looks like your fun uncle, or not even your fun uncle, but like, and in his performance where he was supposed to crush Vance, because Vance is this weirdo, it didn't come to play. And Vance, though, I think he's even more dangerous than Trump in many ways. I think his willingness to do whatever is necessary to achieve power, his nihilism, his flip-flopping on Trump itself, but on other progressive issues. I think a week or two ago, big to-do about Ken Klippenstein released the Trump vetting documents on J.D. Vance. And there wasn't much in there except for the fact that it notes that Vance is not a solid conservative. This is a guy who will go with whatever is best for Vance. And in many ways, I think maybe that's why Donald Trump selected him. Did Donald Trump look into Vance's eyes and see a young Donald Trump there, willing to do whatever is necessary, malleable, willing to do whatever he needs to do to get to where he wants to be? And so some ways I think Vance is a little more dangerous than Trump in that ways. But overall, I mean, some of the things I've seen from Waltz is, certainly his commentary a couple of times now on First Amendment and free speech and how we have to put limits on that is incredibly troubling. His willingness to embrace militarized foreign policy. And I've not heard him speak as much about domestic affairs as I would like, but he's not a progressive. If people are looking for a progressive candidate.
You mentioned
he and Harris expanding Israel, like the expansion. I mean, it was basically like that it's in America's interest to go for greater Israel. The concept, which was very bizarre, and I didn't know.
I saw some pushback that maybe he misspoke. Maybe he was talking about expansion of Iran, but I don't know. I mean, I got to look at that clip. But anyway, he's going to go along with whatever the foreign policy, whatever the blob as the foreign policy.
Right. The blob. That's the third word. Before we said military industrial complex, deep state, and the blob is the same thing. Yeah. But I think the most important takeaway from the debate was that he once again, Waltz, that is, reaffirmed that he's an enemy of free speech.
Yeah.
And so is Harris. Let's take a clip. First, a couple of things that both Harris and Waltz said prior to the debate, and then just a brief clip of what Waltz said during the debate.
Put the Department of Justice of the United States back in the business of justice. We will double the Civil Rights Division and direct law enforcement to counter this extremism. We will hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms, because they have a responsibility to help fight against this threat to our democracy. And if you profit off of hate, if you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we are going to hold you accountable as a community.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
But you guys attack us for not believing in democracy. The most sacred right under the United States democracy is the First Amendment. You yourself have said there's no First Amendment right to misinformation. Kamala Harris wants to use the power of government and big tech to silence people from speaking their minds. That is a threat to democracy that will long outlive this present political moment. I would like Democrats and Republicans to both reject censorship. Let's persuade one another. Let's argue about ideas, and then let's come together afterwards.
You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's the test. That's the Supreme Court test.
Tim, fire in a crowded theater. You guys wanted to kick people off of Facebook for saying that toddlers shouldn't wear masks.
Senator, the governor does have the floor.
Fire in a crowded theater. That is criticizing the policies of the government, which is the right of every American.
Senator.
What I'll say off the bat about that with misinformation is the way the debate begins is by Margaret Brennan of CBS News, just articulating severe misinformation regarding Iran, stating that Iran was just days or maybe a week away from having a nuclear weapon, as well as putting, repeating the Israeli propaganda that the Iranian missile attack failed, and just overly being just incredibly biased in the way she set that statement up. So that CBS News is never going to be released for that misinformation. Yeah. But the Harris talk that you guys showed there, that's incredibly chilling. And I mean,
right, because of the lust. She's like lusting to punish.
But also to the fear it puts in everyone. Yeah. Right? She's saying we're gonna punish people who allow views to be expressed that we don't like, and that then puts a chilling effect. And that's right, the legal term, right, the chilling effect on all these media outfits, on all these social media operations to police. And then this is why you have programs getting shut down by YouTube because they mentioned, look, I know, say Paul Jay, who longtime journalist, great documentarian. He's on the analysis.news. I've learned so much from that guy. By no means in any shape, way, or form would anyone ever confuse Paul Jay with supporting Donald Trump. Paul Jay does a video talking about January 6th, and he includes a video of Donald Trump talking about January 6th just to be able then to respond to Trump's comments. And posting that video of the President of the United States was enough for YouTube to censor Paul. And there was nothing you could do about it. So then we all start self-censoring, right? You have, if you guys are familiar with Ben Norton, independent journalist, when he's on his network, when he does his program now for months now, he doesn't say genocide. He says the G word because he's afraid that he's going to get censored on these programs, that he's going to get pulled off of YouTube or banned.
Have you seen how Jimmy Dore gets around it? Like gets around the vaccine thing? Have you seen
that? What does he say?
He just like ratchets up the sarcasm and how much he's so in love with vaccines. So you know what he's talking about. But
I think it's really important to highlight the fact that a lot of these censorship industrial complex type of things that they're building out through the universities and stuff, they identify something they say that disinformation doesn't necessarily have to be not factual.
Right.
And that the problem with it is that some of it's just malinformation, as in it's bad for the interest of the government. And they are absolutely willing to attack something that is true and go after people for saying things that are true if they are against their interests. And I do think that's the...
Yeah.
That's
as far as I'm concerned, this crap makes them just out and out domestic enemies. I mean, because the free speech ties into every other issue, whether it's about war, the economy, everything.
And the other aspect of it too is you can't violate the First Amendment without violating the Fourth Amendment, particularly in this day and age, right? So how do you know that Jeff and Ryan or Wiley are saying things they shouldn't be saying? Well, you have to spy on them to do that. So you have hand in glove First and Fourth Amendment violations Fourth Amendment violations have just been so obscene over the last couple of decades, beginning with particularly the Bush administration. I think the Clinton administration wanted to do some of this as well, but 9/11 gave the Bush administration the Patriot Act.
Yes.
And just their ability to just spy on us.
Right. Well, they burst into Scott's house and took all his right. And Scott told me that they were asking questions about me, and I'm like, I'm an idiot.
No, he said they were asking
now
about,
I'm on the enemies list of the federal government just because I hang out with Scott.
Anybody who was on his show, they're asking about 6 hours of interviewing.
You had dinner with us in North Carolina, Matt. You probably going to be visited by the FBI.
Oh, I'm on it. I'm on it. I have to be on it already because I've had contact with overseas media for years now. I've been on media in, I don't know, 20 different countries or so. Several of them are enemies, Russia and Iran, but I've been on Japan, I've been on Australia as well, and all of that. But exactly that. I mean, so just by
you mentioned Iran. Let me ask you: do you know this Syed Mohammed Maradi by any chance? Marandi? Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, he's a commentator who's frequently on. He's on George's show a lot. George Galloway's show.
He's an Iranian professor, and yesterday there was a big outburst of everybody saying, "You got to get him on Ask the Inspector. You got to get him."
Amazing.
And we got him tomorrow night. I got to confess, I'm not familiar with him. I was just curious if you guys know him. Okay.
Oh, terrific!
Yeah.
No,
I adore him.
No, he actually made a very interesting. Somebody put a clip out that Scott referenced in the last, I don't know, 24 hours, where he talked about the equality of everybody, of all people. And the way he went through it, and I wish I had the video of it, it was like he was quoting from the Declaration of Independence.
But is it the one where he's talking to the Sky media journalist?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's a great clip.
Yeah.
Oh, I've seen that batted around X, Twitter now, and I haven't watched it yet. And now I definitely will.
I'll send it to you.
Very worth a watch.
Yeah, I knew it was a Sky. But the problem is that we end up all self-censoring. So it's kind of like in the book 1984. If people haven't read it in a while, like I reread it a number of years ago, and I had in my head from the original reading that Big Brother was in every room. They had speakers or listening devices and cameras and everywhere you went. And when you reread the book, you realize that that's not the case. It's just the perception or the fear that anywhere you go could be microphone, could be bugged, there could be a camera. And so they don't have to actually be listening to us, reading our emails, what have you. I mean, they're collecting it all. They hoover it all up and it goes into their data centers. And if they want to find out something about us, or if we set the algorithm off enough by talking about Iran or Epstein or whatever, eventually they might look at you. But it's the self-censoring, and I'm guilty of this. Right. So after Scott was raided by the FBI, I have been invited to talk to Channel 1 in Russia, Channel 1 being one of the larger networks there. Right. And I thought this was a great opportunity to speak to the Russian people. I am critical of the Russian government. We talk about Ukraine. I am always critical of the Russian government, more so critical on the U.S., but I'm also critical of the Russian government. And this is my chance to present myself as a neutral observer who is not taking sides on this. My side is with the people. And I want the Russian people to hear from somebody, an American who spoke like this. And then what happened with Scott? And then I talked to Scott and I said, is this worth the risk? And he said, no, it's not.
Yeah. You got to be a fucking international lawyer to understand how the sanctions might be applied, right?
That's exactly right. And I don't have the money. I don't have the resources I would love to go into a fight with, the U.S. government up to the Supreme Court on a First Amendment thing, but I don't have the resources or the health or the agency or whatever to do that. So what you then do is you start saying, okay, this is not worth the fight for me, right? This is not worth it. And I'll do something else.
And that's what they're hoping
for. You're self-censoring though. And so I actually did Iranian television today, so now you guys are all connected to me because of that. So
that's okay. Welcome. They got me for going to Standing Rock years ago. So
yeah.
When
were you? I was out there too as well. Yeah,
I was out there through Thanksgiving and a bit of time leading up. Yeah.
I was out there beginning of October, so I was out there fairly early.
Where is that?
North Dakota.
No, what is it? I guess.
2016, the oil pipeline protests.
Yeah, the indigenous oil pipeline protests out there, and they had like built it was amazing, but
It was
we all
incredible.
ended up on lists. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah.
But one thing that I would say, you know, Jeff brought up the debates, and I brought up Jose, and you had in the last week you had this Occupy Peace rally in Kingston, New York, and then you had 2 rallies in Washington D.C. The Rescue the Republic, which was sort of a MAGA rally. And then you had what was the other one? Rage Against the War Machine.
Yeah.
Right. So you have all of these. And I would say, you know, even what you were saying about your reservations on J.D. Vance, what definitely comes across with all of the imperfections is that everything across the board is being realigned. That everybody who is interested in the United States and who considers themselves even marginally a patriot, they're talking about the topics that we're talking about here. Yeah. And so you know, in a certain sense, I'm not saying you overlook the flaws as deep as they might be on some of these politicians, but you do see that there is a convergence. You know, like we're, and I hate to use that.
And they're supporting Trump too. Like, you know, Matt said, you know, you wouldn't expect Paul J to support him. Well, look at all these other people too, right? You know, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK. I was surprised actually when I was watching the rally. I didn't think it was going to be like a Trump rally, but most of the speakers were saying, you know, vote for Trump. Are you on the Trump train, Matt? You know, in the sense that it's a lesser of evils. You don't sound too enthusiastic about it.
No, absolutely not. No,
Me either.
I'm Green Party, Jill Stein. I would vote for if she was not on the ballot, I would vote for Chase Oliver. The first time I ever voted third party for the president was in 2012, and I'm not a libertarian, but I voted for Gary Johnson. Because in 2012, what he was offering was, I'm going to end the wars overseas. Yep. I'm going to end the war on drugs, and I'm going to legalize gay marriage. And those are all 3 things I believed in and that I wanted to see happen, and that Romney and Obama weren't offering. So, I mean, that was my first time voting for a president, you know, third party. And since then I've done that.
Well, and then you were also a Green Party candidate in
in 22. But, you know, my fear with some of the Republican fellow travelers we have in this space who are opposed to the Ukraine war, but they're not opposed to what's happening in the Middle East. Tommy Tuberville, the senator from Alabama, gives an incredible floor speech last week on Ukraine. It is absolutely terrific. I mean, he hits it out of the park, very similar to Trump and RFK Jr.'s op-ed in the Hill 2 weeks ago now on the need to negotiate with the Russians. Fantastic. I mean, and brilliant. I mean, it's as if John Mearsheimer wrote the thing or Jeff Sachs wrote it. It's that good. And the same thing with Tuberville's floor speech. And then Tuberville gets to the point where he starts talking about Iran, starts talking about China, and all the realist, historical, common sense lenses that he had in addressing what was occurring in Eastern Europe, he just completely throws away when it comes to the Middle East and Asia. And so, say with the Ukraine war and the Republicans who are against our funding it, I really do believe for most of them, their opposition is because they don't think we should be spending you know, the Congress has appropriated $180 billion for the Ukraine war since February 2022. They think that that $180 billion should be appropriated to kill Chinese rather than to kill Russians. And so, I don't.
Each party picks a different enemy, but it's essentially on behalf of the same financial people.
Well,
right, exactly. Right. What a great racket it is. Isn't that a brilliant racket?
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you kind of see the same thing where we had Democrats who really, really opposed, or I thought they really, really opposed war when we were in Iraq. And then you see them suddenly supporting this Syria and Ukraine
Wiley.
Which was a mess.
Dick Cheney is defending, he is for the peace candidate,
We're
Kamala Harris.
Team Cheney now.
Come on.
That is amazing. That whole Cheney thing is just. I don't even know what to say about it.
To be honest, I don't know that it even surprises me because Joe Biden was always a neoconservative, and anyone who didn't see that and thought he was the lesser of 2 evils was high. I don't know what they were thinking.
So I've been
What's slightly surprising is the way ordinary Democrats are getting enthusiastic about the very same people they thought were disgusting people a few years ago.
They would literally cheer for a never mind.
Yeah.
I'm not going to.
If Harris had chosen Liz Cheney as her vice president, she would not have lost any Democratic Party votes.
No, and we'd have T-shirts that say Cheney on them. And that's why I'm not. No, great.
Well, now
Green all the way.
remember, speaking of, Cheney had Paul Wolfowitz and all of these neocons, right? That's really where they. I don't know if that's where they all got their start, but I've been reading The Hawk and the Dove about George Kennan and Paul Nitze. And what's fascinating is that these guys who were students or followers of Paul Nitze in particular, they were all followers of that great Democrat Henry Scoop Jackson.
Yeah.
Right? And so this goes way back in terms of the fight inside the Democratic Party. I have this book that I have been meaning to read on, what's it called? Traitor to His Class, about Franklin Roosevelt, that he was a traitor to the establishment in the Democratic Party, but because he chose not to go with them even back then. He chose to go for the United States and his policies and working with the Russians, working on the economy. So I don't know. I'm not going to cheerlead for a candidate, particularly myself, but I do think we have to, because for me, the question is, what is our end game? Okay, we know what the end game of our opponents is, right? It's some form of crazy global domination, but those who are opposing that, who want to restore the United States to sanity, have some form of decent relation among nations. Okay, fine. You don't have to like Russia, but at least have some form of decent relation, right? How do we get from here to there? How do you bridge that gap?
I don't know, Ryan. I mean, what we're up against, and I'm afraid that in order to make that happen, we have to have some great cataclysms. That if you look at the history of Europe and the sanity, say that you could say in Europe post World War II, that only comes about, and that sanity has died off, of course, but that only comes about. Same with Japan as well too. It only lasts for a couple of generations, but that comes at the expense of extreme destruction, incredible killing, incredible suffering. I mean, so I don't know. I'm afraid that that's what has to happen in order to change our system, is some type of cataclysm, because I just don't see how the powers that be, the establishment, the empire, gives it up itself. It just won't.
That's true.
Well, and
That's
especially where you see that happening when World War II ends. Yeah, England kind of some of the other countries there, like France and England and other nations, do calm down, but I don't think we ever do. We don't experience that level of destruction. We come out with a lot of power. And you watch the CIA, the OSS, turn into the CIA and get built up and start the Gladio networks and it kind of feels like we got to where we are here because it didn't happen here.
Yeah, I mean, eventually their empires die on them and they're forced to give up their empires. And the French go out very violently. Algeria, Indochina, Vietnam, right?
Well,
so then that's a danger that we face. This is what makes me afraid is, as you see the United States continuing to isolate itself, weaken itself, the economic superiority we once have, it has been whittled away. You see the rise of other nations, the strength of other nations, their willingness to create new systems, BRICS being the most overt, right? The obvious one, and a big BRICS meeting coming up in a couple weeks at the end of the month. This idea that a dying mule kicks hardest. And that's what I'm fearful of with the American empire, is as it dies, it's going to kick really hard. And it's going to, when things are reactionary, they often are very extreme. And so what then becomes the camp that we are? It's the United States. It's the Western powers who are all continuing to whittle down themselves economically, population wise. They're going to be really, parts of Europe are going to have a heck of a time with the changing climate, right? I mean, on and on and on, against a burgeoning world that is not receptive to the West any longer, who gave the West a chance, who were brutalized for it, who've been under their heel for centuries. But if you just want to talk about the American empire for, roughly the last, since the end of World War II, there's going to be a reckoning, I think, that will be quite cataclysmic. And it can be on a number of ways. It's not in a sense that the United States is going to get invaded, but we have set up an economic system in this country that is based solely upon the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And as that continues to diminish, as the dollar weakens, the strong dollar policies that we've had that make us a country of importers, of consumers of imported goods with an inability to manufacture anything ourselves. Well, when the dollar weakens and everything we have to import is that much more expensive and we don't have the capacity to build ourselves, that's going to crush our economy. There's going to be a collapse from that itself, let alone all the other possibilities, all the other things. So you just look at that, and that's something that could occur. The BRICS currency project is moving along a lot faster than any of the experts said. It's not down to 2050, 2060. We might see something from them in terms of a currency that rivals the dollar, at least on the international exchange markets and the trade markets, by the end of this decade.
So I have a question for you on what you're saying. In preparation for this show, I put some thoughts to paper in this article in our Weiner's Substack. It's called "The Road Less Traveled is the Right Path," and I reference a few topics. But one thing I wanted to ask you that I've heard from Scott Ritter in the context of what you say, cataclysm might happen, and then we can do something good. He has referenced I think it's the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you if you are familiar with that, if that is something that you can see as a concept, at least high-level concept for where we are now, because that came at the end of 30 years of religious warfare, right? And they said at the end of that treaty, revenge is over. Right? That was like, we're eliminating vengeance as a policy between nations. It really has to be a completely different concept between nations. Right. So anyway, I wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it creates for the time a modern order of nation states, and that there are rules to the game, essentially. And this is certainly what Roosevelt and Stalin and others attempted following World War II with the United Nations. And we've seen that United Nations system, that effort, it's been murdered, particularly by the Americans and particularly the abuse of the Security Council veto, so that the United Nations is incapable of doing anything. And the same, by extension, then the International Court of Justice, where nations can just essentially ignore it. So how do you build a structure? Because I agree with that. I'm a big fan. One of the most important books for me was T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which is about King Arthur. And I think it's just a brilliant, brilliant political book, and just a wonderful book in general. But White, he says the destiny of mankind is unity. If we don't unify, we end up going back into the trees like monkeys, throwing sticks at each other. And I mean, essentially that idea, what they had 500 years ago, that there has to be a better way. And then again, in 1945, there has to be a better way. I think we're experiencing that right now, because where we're at in this, what we're on the cusp of right now, this is one thing that terrifies me, is we've seen this last year with the genocide in Gaza. That might just be the opening chapter of the book about what we're heading into. It might be, it reminds me of the First World War, how preceding the First World War, our First World War begins in 1914, but in 1912 and 1913, there were the Balkan Wars. Like 1.5 million people were killed. And there were mass atrocities. Ethnic cleansing occurred. No one's heard of the Balkan Wars. No one knows what they're talking about. But at the time, the world was traumatized by what was occurring there, because it was so horrendous, so horrific. And then, well, what came next? 15 million people dead in the fields of France and Belgium, right? I mean, so the idea that maybe we were only on the cusp of what's to come is really a horrifying thought. And this idea then of, well, how do we avoid it? What can we do? In the moment, I don't know, but this idea that we have to advance towards is, as you were bringing up, Ryan, this idea of some type of cooperation, coordination, this relationship among nations where there's a respect to international law and international institutions, because any other way is doomed to war in an age where war itself could be where it'll be the end. And the three big hotspots that we have, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Asia, every one of us can see a clear pathway to nuclear war. Very clear. And if you have a guy come on like Larry Wilkerson, who's part of Eisenhower Media Network, Larry, who was the chief of staff for Colin Powell, Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then when he was the Secretary of State, Larry has been involved in wargaming for decades. And he still has some connection to the war games that take place in Washington, D.C., and in Canberra, and in London, and so forth. And he says, with regards to China, the United States always loses or it results in nuclear war. And that's the result of the war games of China. And the same thing we talked about earlier, possibility of nuclear war in Middle East. One thing I think that happens in the Middle East, even if we were to wave a magic wand and everything gets better tonight, is that you have countries like Turkey saying, you know what, we need a nuclear weapon. Because right now, the two things that keep us from being involved, the two things that keep us from putting our F-16s over Beirut to protect the Lebanese are, one, the American empire, but that's dying. And we're going to go more to Turkey with one foot in Europe and one foot of Asia. Well, we're going to take that foot out of Europe and really head towards Asia. And we're going to line up more with Russia and China and the other BRICS nations because they're rising and the American empire is declining. The other thing that they don't have is a nuclear weapon, because right now there's no way the Turks or anyone else is going to do anything against Israel except for the axis of resistance. Because, again, for Turkey, Gaza, Beirut, sure, there's important to Erdogan. He's a big mouth anyway, but it's important to the Turks. But it's not important enough to get Ankara nuked. And so I think in 5 years or so, we're going to see Turkey with a nuclear weapon.
How about everybody
and the Turks
has
are
one?
Still in NATO, though, too.
Yeah,
so
it's pretty amazing. Yeah, it's. But I mean, how long can they last? And I know BRICS is an economic institution primarily, and NATO is a military one. How long can the Turks exist in both?
It doesn't feel compatible to me. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It doesn't feel compatible to me. Yeah. I don't.
Yeah. And the West, Europe, NATO just had a new Secretary General come in, Mark Rutte, who was the head of Netherlands, Prime Minister of the Netherlands for 14 years. So very well
The guy with the little NAFO dog photo on day one.
Yeah. I'm sure he's tweeting behind one of those things.
They always have these little country people running NATO. How is
because
that?
they're willing to do so. Stoltenberg, who just left as Secretary General, who was incredibly hawkish, as we all know, he had been a Norwegian Prime Minister. Where did he get the chops? Where did he get the bona fides to become the NATO Secretary General and to be the head of this war-fighting organization and to stand up to tyrannical Russia and Putin? We'll go back to Libya in 2011. In the spring of 2011, the Norwegians are leading efforts to mediate an end to the war, to the crisis in Libya. And in the spring, they are close to getting there. And then what happens? They're told to get out because NATO's coming in, and we don't want to hear about these peace talks. And NATO, of course, then lost its air campaign. Which nation led that air campaign? Which nation had more sorties than any other nation in the air campaign? Norway. And then Jens Stoltenberg, who was the prime minister, then becomes Secretary General of NATO later on. Mark Rutte, the Dutch, same thing. They're very aggressive. And the thing that should scare us all is that Rutte has to come into NATO, replacing Stoltenberg, right, who is, of course, very hawkish, right, very aggressive. And how does Rutte then make his mark? How does Rutte be somebody how does he just simply not?
He's got to up the ante.
He's got to escalate it. And so there's two things. He can be hawkish, more hawkish on Russia and things like that. Most likely where he's going to try and make his mark is to globalize NATO, right? Again, because NATO is the military arm of the American empire. It's a dying empire. We need to make ourselves more relevant. We need to entrench ourselves. We need to put up barricades against the barbarians. So NATO is already globalized. You can ask the Afghans or the Libyans about that. But you're going to see, I think, possibly Japan coming into NATO, South Korea coming into NATO, Australia coming into NATO. And because NATO needs to prove itself and it needs to be global and it needs to continue, right? I mean, so, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. I wish I had some better thoughts and was more optimistic for you guys, but unfortunately,
that's okay. Stephen Corcoran, one of our regular viewers, we just flashed the comment and says Matt is a great guy, and I certainly agree. And we should respect Matt's time, so maybe he'll come back another time if we don't keep him all night.
Thank you very much, Matt, for being
I
here.
appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I really like what you guys are doing, and I'm happy to come back anytime. And for the folks who watched and listened, thank you very much.
Okay, and if they want to read your Substack, that's matthewho.substack.com.
Correct.
And the EisenhowerMediaNetwork.org. Thank you very much, Matt.
All right, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
All right.
Hi, everybody.
We'll be back next week at the same time. Join us for the Whiners every Tuesday night. No, what's tonight? Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Take care, everybody.
All right.